I wanted to do a review video for the Phaedo questions. Again, I would imagine that most of what I say here is also in the videos, but if something I say helps, then that's great. And also, again, you should watch this video and think about or compare what I say to what you actually wrote so that you can see if you're on the right track. And again, should you have any questions about anything, you want anything clarified, please contact me. So the first question, why does Socrates believe that the philosopher should welcome death? That has a specific answer. Not a vague answer, really there's one answer to that, and that is because true knowledge is only possible after death, according to Socrates. Now this, of course, immediately gets us involved in Plato's theory of knowledge, his theory of reality, the theory of the forms, but I think that the way that he presents it in the beginning, he doesn't go into that in great detail in the beginning. All it basically says is that the senses, which are connected with the body, do not help us. They hinder us when it comes to gaining knowledge. And the philosopher, who is a lover of truth or the lover of knowledge, really can't wait to be rid of the body so that they can get more closely in tune with reality, that is, get knowledge, true knowledge of absolute reality. So the philosopher welcomes death not because they're tired of life or death is not to be feared. No, the philosopher welcomes death for a very specific reason, for knowledge. Number two, connected question, how does Socrates conceive of death? What I meant was, what is his basic theory of death? That is, if we compare Socrates' starting point, his assumptions about death, with, say, Epicurus' assumptions, we can see that they have contradictory or incompatible starting points when it comes to actually even talking about death. Well, Epicurus's starting point, how he conceives of death, is that it's the privation of all awareness, the absolute and irrevocable end of all consciousness and awareness. Socrates, on the other hand, conceives of death simply as the separation of the soul and body. That is the answer to that question. That is, his basic conception of death is that it's a separation of soul and body. And then, of course, he believes a lot more about the soul. And the question that follows from the first definition of death, separation of soul and body, is, can the soul actually exist without the body? And if so, how, right? Is really the central underlying question of the dialogue. But his basic conception of death is that it's separation of soul and body. Three, why does Socrates say on page 54 that the philosopher dishonors the body? I'm sorry about that. I believe that that's the wrong page number for our specific text. But I hope that you were familiar enough with the quote to answer the question. I think in general, the philosopher dishonors the body because the body and its instincts, its inclinations for pleasures, its distraction from by the senses actually leads the philosopher away from knowledge, away from truth. So that when the philosopher lives, they try to, as much as possible, separate themselves from the body before death. So that when death comes, they will be as pure as possible. That is, they will be as detached from the body as it's possible for us to be when we're actually alive. So the philosopher basically dishonors the body kind of for a related reason to why the philosopher welcomes death. That is, the philosopher dishonors the body because the body leads the philosopher away from knowledge and truth. Number four, what does the argument from opposites try to establish about the soul? Well, that argument from opposites is quite interesting, but kind of troubling. But, well, that the soul must, that the soul, that is, the living soul must come from the dead, I think is what that is, that the soul is immortal because opposites come from opposites. Therefore, the living soul comes from the dead soul. Therefore, the soul continues to exist after the death of the body. I think it's about the answer to that question. It could be something in that range. Number 5, why does Socrates believe that knowledge is recollection? And what does this have to do with the immortality of the soul? Well, the Socratic belief that knowledge is recollection is something that you'll find in other dialogues much more clearly or much more thoroughly, seriously inquired into. The idea is that there's all sorts of things that we know that we couldn't have learned in this life, mostly having to do with ideas, with concepts. That there are some concepts that seem to be innate, and the idea is that these things, at least, including the forms, the idea of absolute beauty or absolute good or absolute virtue, that we know these things, and already we're not taught them. And all we need to do is recollect them. There's a famous dialogue called the Meno, for instance, where Socrates asks questions of a young boy who's never studied mathematics and shows that he can remember certain truths about geometry, supposedly, and that this is supposed to establish that all real knowledge is remembering, is recollection. Of course, if this were true, it would have an interesting implication for the immortality of the soul, because the idea is that if we're recollecting what we've already learned, when did we learn these things? Socrates says we must have learned them in the time before we had bodies, when the soul existed before it entered into the body. So if he can establish that knowledge is recollection, he can establish at least that the soul existed before the body. As his friends point out, that's not exactly what they're looking for, because what they're trying to prove is that the soul exists after the body. However, it would be important, because if the soul does exist before the body, then clearly the soul can exist independently of the body. So it actually is quite closely connected with the idea of immortality of the soul. Number 6, if the soul is like the forms, and the forms again are what he calls the absolutes, the in itself, beauty in itself, justice in itself, virtue in itself, these pure ideas that form the center of Plato's philosophy. If the soul is like the forms, how does this argue for its immortality? Well, the idea is that the soul, and we might think of the soul here as intellect or consciousness or the ability to reason, it clearly knows the forms and it knows pure concepts. It's able to understand them. Socrates' argument, the so-called argument from affinity, is that if the soul is able to grasp these pure ideas, then it must be like them. It must be enough like them. And the forms and all pure concepts, let's say concepts of mathematics, are in Plato's view eternal and unchanging. So if the soul is like them, then it itself must be eternal and unchanging. Number 7, explain why Simmias's idea of soul as harmony is a challenge to Socrates' attempt to prove that the soul is immortal. I think that it's the deepest challenge to Socrates' account. Because basically what it says is that, well, soul and body are different. Body is physical, soul is not. So soul and body are different. We consist of both. And but the idea that the soul is harmony is the idea that the soul is dependent upon body. Just as the harmony produced by a musical instrument is something non-physical, they would say. But it depends upon the physical instrument. So even though it's different from it, it's still connected to it insofar as if you take away the instrument, you also take away the harmony. And the harmony doesn't go on existing without the instrument. That's the idea with the soul, is that the soul is non-physical, but it depends upon the physical body. So that if you take away the body in death, where the body surely does die, then the soul would die along with it, because it's in this dependent relationship. So if Simmias's idea of soul as harmony is correct, then Socrates' idea of the soul as immortal must be wrong. Number 8, what is the mistake that Socrates warns his friends against? I'm sorry, again, page numbers are different. Forgive me for that. What is the mistake that Socrates warns his friends against? And why do you think he brings this up at this particular moment? Well, The mistake is to become misologists, misologist, misologist. You don't want to be a misologist. That is a hater of argument. It would be a mistake. People become haters of arguments when arguments let them down. And arguments let people down when they realize that an argument that they found really convincing is really not all that convincing at all, and there are other arguments that contradict it, which are just as convincing. So people end up not trusting arguments, not trusting philosophy, basically. But Socrates says it would be a grave mistake to become a misologist, to become a hater of arguments. Why does he bring this up at this particular moment? Well, because the conversation is kind of at a standstill. Socrates has given a number of reasons to believe the soul is immortal, and then these two characters, Simmias and Cebes, have seemingly come up with more convincing arguments that the soul is not immortal. So I think Socrates warns his friends, at this moment, don't give up on arguments just because it's hard to tell which is the better argument, which argument actually leads to truth. Number 9, do you think it is possible purely through argumentation to discover the true nature of the soul and of death? Why or why not? Of course, there's no right answer to that question, but I asked it because that's exactly what Socrates and Plato are trying to do. Purely through argumentation, through pure reasoning, through discussion, to discover the true nature of the soul and of death. It's an important, I think, decision whether or not you go along with him. For instance, you may think that the true nature of the soul and of death is a scientific question, having to do with observation, having to do with what we can actually observe about the living organism. If you go that way, then I think you reject the whole Platonic way of dealing with the question, which is dealing with it as a metaphysical question, one that cannot be decided through empirical observation, but must be decided through reason itself. So there's no right answer to that question. There's no wrong answer to that question, but it's important to know kind of where you stand on that. Number 10, why does Socrates think his knowledge is recollection idea refutes that the soul is a harmony? Well, just because if knowledge is recollection is true, as we saw, then the soul existed before it entered into the body, and therefore it is not merely an effect of the body, because before it enters into the body, it exists independently, and so it can't be a mere effect of the body. Number 11, Socrates argues that sometimes the soul leads the body rather than the body leading the soul. Why does he think this is a refutation of the soul as harmony argument? Well, I think it's a very interesting argument and one of the strongest arguments, because the idea is that if the soul were merely an effect of the body, the way that the harmony is an effect of the instrument being played in a certain way, then it would always be led by the body. That is, the state of the soul would always be a mere reflection of the state of the body. But what he points out is that we have something like willpower that enables us to say no to the body. That is, when we're thirsty, we don't necessarily go and find something to drink. When we are sleepy, we don't necessarily go right to sleep. We can oppose the urges, the desires, the inclinations of our bodies, which would seem to say that the idea that the soul is a mere effect of the body is mistaken, that the soul actually acts independently of body. And that's a kind of an interesting argument. I think one of the strongest ones, actually, against the soul as harmony idea. Finally, very difficult question. These are all difficult questions. Number 12, how does Socrates think the number 3's relationship to oddness can help establish the immortality of the soul? I went into this, I'm sure, in the videos. But my understanding of the argument, as far as my understanding goes, is that the number 3 is essentially odd. So you'll never have 3 without also having oddness. That is, the number 3 could never admit of evenness, the opposite of oddness. Well, the idea is the soul's relationship to oddness, that 3's relationship to oddness is like the soul's relationship to life. That is, wherever you have 3, you have oddness. Wherever you have the soul, you have life, so that you couldn't actually have the soul connected with death. That would be like having an even number 3.